It was just another routine day in the courthouse where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as the next case was called. The woman stepped forward and approached the judge's bench. She was dressed casually in a simple blouse and slacks, her demeanor calm yet composed as she walked to face the judge. His gaze briefly flicked up from the papers in front of him, but it was barely a glance, and he continued to scribble notes on the forms before him. He wasn't interested in who she was or what her story might be. He only saw the facts before him, and the facts said she was here for a fine. The judge's voice was gruff and impersonal as he announced the fine without even looking her way. His words were brief and to the point. She had parked improperly and therefore needed to pay the fine in full or face further consequences. There was no compassion in his tone, no attempt to understand or empathize with her situation. It was simply a matter of procedure, and his job was to enforce it. His voice seemed to echo in the small room as she listened patiently, but there was no real reaction from her. She didn't flinch, she didn't protest. And yet there was something beneath the surface, something the judge hadn't noticed, of quiet determination that wasn't immediately apparent. The woman took a moment to absorb what had just happened. Her expression remained neutral, but inside she was already calculating her next steps. She was used to situations like this where people underestimated her, where assumptions were made based on her appearance, where they didn't bother to look beyond the surface and see who she really was. But she wasn't angry, not yet. She was more disappointed in how quickly people made judgments, how often they failed to recognize the complexities of a person's identity, how their assumptions could change the course of an interaction without them even realizing it. As she turned to leave the courtroom, the weight of the moment lingered with her. She was familiar with this feeling of being overlooked, dismissed as unimportant or inconsequential in the eyes of those who held power and authority. And it was all too common for people like her, people who had worked tirelessly to get where they were, only to find themselves reduced to stereotypes or worse, invisible to the world around them. But this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just about her, it was about something bigger, something that would require her to stand up and make her voice heard. But for now, she left quietly. There would be time to address it later. For the judge, however, the encounter was already over in his mind. It was just another case, another day on the job, and he hadn't thought twice about the woman who had just left his courtroom. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that this woman wasn't just anyone. She wasn't some nameless figure standing in front of him that day. She was a leader, a voice in the halls of Congress, a force of change who had made a mark in politics and who would soon make her presence felt in a way the judge could never have anticipated. As the woman stepped out of the courthouse and into the bustling street, she pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. A text from her colleague in Washington blinked up at her, and in an instant, everything shifted. The message wasn't about the case or the fine, but a quick update on the local news that was beginning to spread. The judge's actions had caught the attention of reporters who had started asking questions about his conduct in the courtroom. And that's when she realized that the seemingly insignificant moment in the courthouse had taken on a life of its own. The story was quickly gaining traction. What had been dismissed as an ordinary case was now something much larger. She stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd, processing the information. There was no immediate anger or frustration bubbling up, but instead a quiet clarity. She was used to being underestimated. People often judged her by the way she looked, and this judge's behavior was no different. He had treated her the same way countless others had, with disregard. She was just another person to him, nothing more than a name on a sheet of paper, a number in his day. Yet what he didn't know was that she was far more than what met the eye. The more she thought about it, the more it began to gnaw at her. This wasn't just about a misstep in a courtroom. It was the kind of mistake that reflected a larger problem, a deep-seated issue of how people like her, people of color, were often treated as invisible, as though they didn't hold the same significance as others. She had faced this kind of bias before in different forms, but this time it felt different. There was something about it that made her think this was an opportunity to turn the tide, not just for herself, but for so many others who faced the same prejudices daily. She didn't feel helpless. In fact, she felt empowered. She was a member of Congress. She had spent years advocating for those whose voices were often unheard, fighting for the rights of marginalized communities, pushing for justice and equality. But in that courtroom, she had been treated as if she were no different than anyone else who didn't have a say in how things were done. She had been reduced to a face in a crowd, someone whose worth could be calculated in mere numbers. And that was the issue she had to address. But how? She thought about her next steps. The media was already buzzing with the story. She'd had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control when the public latched onto a narrative. The judge's actions were being dissected, the tone of his comments scrutinized, and questions were being raised about his impartiality and professionalism. It was clear the incident was drawing attention, but the question remained: did she want to make this just another scandal, or did she have the opportunity to use this moment as a platform for something more meaningful? With a deep breath, she made a decision. She would let the story unfold, but she would take control of how it was told. She would turn this moment of personal indignity into an opportunity for a much larger conversation about racial bias, about respect, and about fairness in the system. She wasn't just going to let this slip away as an unfortunate incident. It was going to be a turning point. She would make sure of it. The phone in her hand buzzed again, this time with a text from her team back in Washington. They were already working on a statement. They were ready to respond. But she knew the real work was just beginning. As the woman sat in her office later that afternoon, the weight of the courthouse encounter still lingered. Her hands rested on the polished wood of her desk as she stared out the window at the city below. The streets were full of life, people going about their daily routines, unaware of the quiet storm that had begun to brew in the political world. She could feel the ripple effect of what had happened, and it wasn't just about her. It was about something far bigger, something she couldn't ignore. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from a colleague or her team. It was an alert from the news. Headlines were already calling attention to the interaction between the judge and the woman, though they still didn't know who she was. The story was spreading fast. She leaned back in her chair, the soft hum of the city fading into the background as her thoughts turned inward. She had seen this before, the way stories like hers could be twisted, minimized, or misunderstood, especially when it came to race. People rarely bothered to look beyond the surface, to consider the complexities that defined a person. In the eyes of the judge, she had been just another name on a case file, but she wasn't just anyone. She had spent years working hard to be where she was, and now it felt like all of that hard work was being reduced to a single moment in a courtroom. She knew that in her position, she had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to those who had come before her and those who would follow. She had the power to make change, to speak out and challenge the very systems that allowed this kind of oversight to happen. But it wasn't just about taking action for herself. It was about using this moment to call attention to the deeper issue that so many people faced every day. It was about using her voice to fight against the kind of subtle but pervasive bias that existed in all corners of society. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was her chance to do something that could echo far beyond the courthouse doors. She didn't have to react in anger or frustration. She could use this moment as a way to educate, to shed light on the realities of how people of color were often treated in spaces where they were supposed to be afforded equal respect. There was power in knowledge, and she was no stranger to the challenges that came with it. She had spent years working in government, in a system that often felt rigged against her and her community. But the knowledge she had gained about the way the system worked, the way people were conditioned to think about power, race, and identity, was exactly what she needed to drive this conversation forward. Her next steps weren't about vengeance. They were about action. She would use the story of what had happened to her as an example of the systemic issues that plagued the justice system. It wasn't enough to just call out the judge's behavior. She needed to make sure this moment wasn't forgotten or swept under the rug. She would use it to highlight the urgent need for change in how those in power, particularly in the legal system, viewed the people they served. She knew this was bigger than a single judge or a single fine. This was about every person who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued. And it was about showing the world that change was possible, not through individual apologies, but through real systemic reform. With renewed determination, she picked up the phone and dialed her team. It was time to turn this incident into an opportunity. The media was already hungry for the story, and she knew she had the platform to push it into the spotlight. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. This was only the beginning. By the time the woman returned home that evening, her inbox was flooded with messages. News outlets, friends, supporters, and even strangers had begun reaching out, commenting on the incident at the courthouse. The story had already gone viral. Social media was ablaze with commentary, and the hashtags were gaining traction. Some questioned the fairness of the judge's actions, while others criticized his apparent disregard for the woman's position. The comments were fierce, but it was clear that people were paying attention. The online conversation took on a life of its own. Memes and commentary flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The judge's dismissive behavior was quickly labeled as yet another example of racial bias in the justice system. Many of her supporters, especially those who had experienced similar treatment, rallied behind her, calling for accountability. The phrase #recognizer began to trend, symbolizing both the way the woman had been ignored and the larger issue of how people of color were often erased from positions of power. But amid the support, there were those who questioned the narrative. Some claimed that the woman was simply blowing the situation out of proportion, that the judge had made a mistake, but wasn't necessarily guilty of anything more than a minor lapse in judgment. Others suggested she had taken the opportunity to make it about race in order to fuel a larger agenda. The critiques didn't bother her, though. She had been the target of these kinds of comments before. She was no stranger to the pushback that often came when someone in her position spoke out. She understood the dynamics at play here. There was something almost predictable about the backlash. When people in power were called out for their actions, they often reacted with defensiveness, dismissing the experience of those who spoke out. She had seen it firsthand in Washington and in her own life. People were often willing to dismiss uncomfortable truths to minimize the impact of their behavior on others. But now she wasn't just a lone voice in the crowd. Now she had the opportunity to push the conversation further, to challenge the system more openly. What caught her attention, however, was the number of people who didn't just take to social media to offer their opinions. They took action. Calls were made to the courthouse. Emails flooded the judge's office, demanding an explanation for his treatment of the woman. Local activists and community leaders spoke out, joining the conversation and amplifying the voices that had previously been ignored. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that this moment had gone far beyond her personal experience. The media, too, was now in full pursuit of the story. She was contacted by reporters who wanted her to comment, to provide more context on what had happened and what it meant. Some wanted to focus on the sensational aspects of the case, trying to get a soundbite about the judge's mistake. But she wasn't interested in just sensationalizing the event. She wanted to use this platform to educate, to ensure that the conversation stayed focused on the larger issue, the way society often treated people like her as if they didn't belong in spaces of power. While the press continued to cover the growing story, she took a moment to sit down with her team. The next move was clear. It was time to issue a statement that would not only address the judge's actions, but also highlight the need for real change. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by as just another headline. She was going to make sure it was the beginning of something much bigger. Back in his chambers, the judge sat at his desk, staring at the phone in his hand. The screen displayed yet another alert about the incident in the courtroom earlier that day. It wasn't just a passing news cycle anymore. It had become a story that everyone was talking about. His name had been mentioned repeatedly, and not in a positive light. The news outlets had zeroed in on the fine he'd imposed, and more importantly, on the woman he had dismissed with a simple sentence, without even considering who she was. The judge couldn't escape it now. The consequences of his oversight were unfolding in real time. At first, he tried to dismiss the reports. After all, he had done his job, hadn't he? The woman had parked illegally, and he had simply enforced the law. He had followed the rules, and to him, it had been as straightforward as any other case. But then his assistant knocked on the door, hesitating before entering with an envelope. It contained a brief note delivered from the courthouse PR office. The woman it seen was a member of Congress, a prominent figure with a strong following. His stomach sank. He hadn't known that. He hadn't bothered to look beyond the surface, to ask the right questions, to even consider that she might be someone important. His mind raced. How had he missed that? His first instinct was to ignore it, to chalk it up to the chaos of the day. But deep down, he knew he couldn't just let this go. The backlash was too strong, and this was no longer just about a simple parking violation. It was about his failure to see her for who she really was, a leader, an advocate, someone who had earned respect through years of hard work and dedication. He had treated her like anyone else, but she wasn't just anyone else. He had made a mistake, one that had serious implications for his reputation, but more importantly, for his integrity as a judge. The realization weighed on him heavily. For the first time, he began to truly understand the depth of the issue. This wasn't just a case of him making a small error in judgment. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that he had never fully acknowledged before: the bias that could cloud judgment, the tendency to overlook people based on their appearance, their background, or their status. He had done it before, in countless subtle ways. It was a bias that many others, including himself, had learned to ignore or excuse. But now, in the cold light of his office, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. The implications of his actions were far-reaching. What would his colleagues think? How would the public view him now? He had to admit the truth to himself. He had let his assumptions guide his actions. And those assumptions had cost him more than just a case. They had cost him the respect of a community that trusted him to be fair and impartial. As he mulled over his mistake, his thoughts turned to the woman. She had not reacted in anger, at least not outwardly, but she was someone with the power to make this situation known. She had the influence, the platform, and the knowledge to call out the injustices embedded in the system. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she wasn't just a victim of his error. She had the ability to make him, and others like him, confront their biases head-on. The phone rang. It was his assistant again, this time with a direct request from the media. They wanted a statement from him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The judge felt his heart race as he took a deep breath, preparing himself to address the situation head-on. He knew what he had to do next. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about acknowledging his mistake, taking responsibility, and learning from it. But the most difficult part would be speaking publicly, admitting that he had let his biases cloud his judgment. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could choose how he responded, and that response would determine whether he could regain the trust of the public, and perhaps even of the woman he had so carelessly dismissed. The next day, as the judge prepared for his press conference, he could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. The room was tense as reporters gathered, microphones set up in neat rows, cameras poised. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. He had spent the entire night contemplating his words, trying to figure out the right way to address the controversy. How could he take ownership of his mistake, admit his bias, and repair the damage he had done without sounding defensive or dismissive? He had made a misstep, and the entire world was watching him now. The press conference began with a few brief introductions from his staff before the judge took the stage. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt this vulnerable before, standing in front of a room full of people, knowing that every word he spoke would be scrutinized. He cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of reporters, trying to steady his nerves. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but betraying a hint of apprehension. "I am here today to address the events that took place in my courtroom yesterday. As many of you know, a woman appeared before me for a minor parking violation. After reviewing the facts, I issued the fine, as is my responsibility. However, it has come to light that I failed to recognize who she was at the time, and I deeply regret that oversight." He paused, letting the words sink in. The cameras clicked as journalists typed out his every word. "I did not take into account the woman's position, her background, or the fact that she is a member of Congress. I failed to see her as more than just a case number, and for that, I am truly sorry. It was an error in judgment, and I acknowledged that. This was not a matter of the law, it was a matter of respect. I should have treated her with the same respect that I afford all those who enter my courtroom. I failed in that respect. There was a murmur in the room. The judge could feel the eyes of the reporters on him, their skepticism palpable. He knew this wasn't going to be enough to silence the critics. He had to go further. I also recognized that my actions may have reflected a deeper issue, one that goes beyond this individual case. We live in a society where assumptions are made based on appearance, status, and background. I have seen it happen in my own courtroom, and I have been guilty of it myself. This is not an isolated incident. It's a systemic problem that affects many people every day. And I am committed to examining my own biases, as well as working to ensure that our justice system holds true to the values of fairness, equality, and respect for all. The judge's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was still. He had said what he needed to say, but the true test would be in the actions that followed. A few reporters raised their hands, eager to ask questions, but the judge motioned for them to wait. I know an apology is just the first step, he continued. I will be working with my colleagues to ensure that this kind of oversight doesn't happen again. I will also be taking part in training to better understand and address implicit bias in the courtroom. This is something I take seriously, and I hope to use this experience as a turning point, not only for myself, but for the system I serve. As he finished speaking, the room was filled with a flurry of questions, some challenging, others curious. The judge answered as best as he could, trying to remain composed despite the pressure mounting. It wasn't easy to stand in front of so many people and admit his mistakes, but he knew it was the right thing to do. There would be no going back, no pretending this didn't happen. The road to redemption would be long, but he was ready to walk it. Meanwhile, the woman who had sparked the entire ordeal sat in her office, watching the press conference on her laptop. She wasn't surprised by the judge's apology, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that the conversation had reached this point. The judge had admitted his error, but she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger movement. Her decision to speak out, to let the world see what had transpired, had ignited a fire. And now, the judge's reckoning was part of the shift in the conversation, a shift toward real accountability and change. For her, it wasn't about one judge or one fine. It was about making sure that no one else would be overlooked or dismissed the way she had been. The story was far from over. In the days that followed the judge's public admission, the story continued to dominate the news cycle. The apology, while a necessary step, was far from the end of the matter. The woman, now firmly at the center of the conversation, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made her stand, and the ripples were becoming waves. Her phone rang nonstop, her inbox flooded with messages from constituents, colleagues, and activists who were grateful for her courage to speak up. But it was the messages from young people, many of whom were people of color, that resonated the most. They thanked her for showing them that their voices mattered, for standing up when so many others might have stayed silent. The news stories now framed the judge's apology not as the resolution of the incident, but as the beginning of a broader dialogue about racial bias and fairness in the legal system. Social media buzzed with calls for reform, advocating for the kinds of systemic changes that could prevent such oversights from happening again. The woman was being celebrated as a voice for those who had been overlooked by institutions that were supposed to protect them. But despite the support, she remained focused on what lay ahead. She spent her days meeting with her team, drafting new legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in the courtroom. She knew that an apology, while important, wasn't enough. She needed to create lasting change. Her legislative proposal would mandate unconscious bias training for judges, increase diversity in court appointments, and establish community oversight boards that could provide accountability from outside the judicial system. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that true reform required more than just one judge's admission of guilt. It required a complete shift in how the legal system interacted with marginalized communities. But while the woman worked tirelessly on her plans for reform, she couldn't help but reflect on the personal toll the situation had taken on her. It had been a grueling few days, filled with media attention, long meetings, and endless discussions about strategy. Yet, amid all of it, she felt a quiet sense of pride. The judge's apology, although imperfect, had opened a door that had been closed for far too long. His acknowledgement of bias wasn't a panacea, but it was a crucial first step. And if he could admit his mistakes, then perhaps others in positions of power could do the same. One evening, after another exhausting day, she sat in her office with a cup of tea, watching the evening news. A segment came on featuring the judge, his face somber as he spoke about the steps he was taking to address his actions. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication. His words, although an attempt at healing, were a reminder that accountability wasn't something people were accustomed to giving easily. But now he had no choice, and neither did the rest of the system. The public reckoning that had begun with one small misstep in a courthouse had grown into a movement. The woman knew that the story didn't end with the judge's apology. It had only just begun. She still had a long road ahead, one that would require not just political maneuvering, but the kind of cultural shift that would take years to fully realize. But she was prepared for it. She had the support, the knowledge, and the determination to push forward. As she looked ahead, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The system was far from perfect, but moments like these, small victories in a long battle, showed her that change was possible. And even if it took time, she would keep pushing until the conversation shifted, until those in power understood that they could no longer ignore those who had been overlooked for so long. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had been dismissed, for all those whose voices hadn't been heard. And this time, her voice wasn't going to be silenced. Months passed since the judge's public apology and the flood of media coverage that had followed. The woman had become a symbol of resilience and leadership, her advocacy for fairness and accountability earning her respect across the political spectrum. Her legislative proposal, designed to address bias in the judicial system, was gaining traction. She had already met with key stakeholders, lawyers, activists, and community leaders who were eager to support her efforts. Yet, despite the progress, she knew the fight was far from over. The day finally came when her bill was up for debate in Congress. She stood in the chamber, preparing to make her case. The room was filled with representatives, some supportive, some skeptical. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and yet, in this moment, it didn't faze her. She had faced much worse during her career, and she had learned to navigate those battles with poise and conviction. This was no different. As she stepped up to the podium, she was reminded of the first time she had ever stood in front of a crowd, all those years ago, when she had first decided to enter politics. That feeling of uncertainty, the fear of being judged, had long since faded. She was no longer that nervous newcomer. She was a seasoned leader who had earned her place at the table. "This bill is not just about one judge," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about an entire system that has failed to see the full humanity of those it serves. It's about the countless people who walk into courtrooms every day, only to be treated as faceless cases rather than as individuals. It's about ensuring that those in power understand that fairness and respect are not optional. They are the bedrock of justice." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. A few representatives nodded, while others sat with their arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. But she could feel the shift in the room, the growing recognition that what she was saying wasn't just a political stance. It was a moral imperative. The judge, who apologized publicly for his oversight, she continued, made a critical step toward accountability. But we cannot stop there. We must go further. We must create systems that prevent such oversights in the first place, systems that actively dismantle bias before it has the chance to affect decisions. This bill is a step toward that goal. The debate that followed was intense. Some lawmakers argued that such measures were unnecessary, that they would place undue burden on the courts, and that bias training and oversight could lead to inefficiencies. Others, however, saw the merit in the proposal, recognizing that the judicial system's credibility depended on the public's trust, and that trust had been eroded by countless instances of unequal treatment. As the hours passed, the woman remained resolute, responding to every objection with calm precision. She knew that changing the system wasn't easy, and that real progress often met resistance. But she was undeterred. This wasn't about passing a bill for the sake of passing a bill. It was about ensuring that the next generation of lawmakers and judges would operate with the knowledge that they could no longer afford to ignore the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. When the vote was finally called, there was a moment of silence. The weight of the decision hung in the air as the representatives cast their ballots. The woman held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it was up to them to decide. Then the results were announced. The bill had passed. There was a quiet sense of victory in the room, but for the woman, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that this was just one step in a long journey. The work wasn't done, and she would continue to push forward. She had taken the first step toward dismantling the systems of bias that had allowed people to be overlooked for far too long. And while there was still much to be done, today had shown her that real change was possible. One decision, one conversation, one law at a time. As she left the chamber, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but now, more than ever, she knew she wasn't alone. People were listening, and they were ready to make a difference. This was only the beginning.